I wasn't supposed to matter. Not in a house like that. Not in a world where people like me cleaned the floors but never left footprints. The first thing you learn growing up as a maid's son is how to be invisible, how to move without sound, how to exist without being seen. And I was good at it, better than anyone. Because survival depends on it when you live in a place where power doesn't raise its voice, it just changes the air in the room. The Romano estate sat on the edge of the city like it owned the skyline. White stone glowing under soft lights, security cameras blinking like silent eyes, and every morning before sunrise, I walked through the service entrance with my mother, head down, hands steady, pretending I didn't notice the men in tailored suits who noticed everything. I told myself it didn't matter, that this wasn't my life, just a place I passed through. But the truth is, you can't stand that close to power without feeling its gravity pulling at you, shaping the way you think, the way you breathe. That's where I first saw her, Sophia Romano, standing at the top of the staircase like she belonged to a different version of reality, sunlight catching in her hair, her expression distant, like even in a house that big, she had nowhere to go. She wasn't supposed to look at me, and I wasn't supposed to look at her. That was the unspoken rule, but for a second, just 1 second, her eyes flicked in my direction, and something in my chest tightened before I forced myself to look away. Because boys like me don't exist in her world, not unless something goes wrong. And something always goes wrong. It started as a feeling, the kind you don't question if you've spent your whole life paying attention. A shift in the rhythm of the house, footsteps that didn't match the pattern, voices that carried a different kind of silence, the kind that makes your instincts wake up before your mind understands why. I was in the East Corridor, polishing the marble that never stayed clean for long, when I heard it, not loud, not dramatic, just wrong, and I froze for half a second, listening, measuring, deciding, because that's what survival teaches you, not to panic, not to guess, but to move. When it matters, I shouldn't have gotten involved. That's what any normal person would say, that it wasn't my place, that it wasn't my problem, but when I turned the corner and saw her, standing there alone, unaware of the shift in the air, something inside me made the decision before I could stop it. I moved. No hesitation, no plan, just instinct, stepping between her and something she hadn't even seen yet, my voice low, steady, the way you talk when you don't want to scare someone but you need them to listen, don't move. She looked at me like I had just broken every rule in the world, confusion flashing across her face, but she didn't step back, didn't scream, just stayed there, and that was enough. Because in that moment, invisible didn't matter anymore. In that moment, I wasn't a maid's son. I was the reason nothing happened to her. And I didn't know it yet, but that single decision, that one step forward, was about to change everything. I felt her breath before I heard her voice, close enough to notice the hesitation in it, like she was trying to decide whether to trust me or call for someone else. And that half second stretched longer than it should have, long enough for me to realize how strange this must look. A servant standing too close, speaking too directly, breaking rules that people like me are not supposed to even acknowledge. But I did not step back, because something in the air still felt wrong, still unsettled, like a storm that had not decided whether it would arrive or disappear. "Why?" she asked quietly, her voice steady but curious, not afraid. And that surprised me more than anything, because most people in her position would have reacted differently, would have questioned authority, called security, created distance, but she stayed exactly where she was, her eyes searching mine like she was trying to understand something deeper than the moment itself. I exhaled slowly, forcing my voice to remain calm, controlled, the way you speak when every word matters. "Because something is off," I said, not looking away from the hallway behind her, tracking movement, listening for patterns that did not belong. Because once you learn to notice those things, you cannot unlearn them. She followed my gaze then, turning slightly, and for a second, the world held. Still, quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like the house itself was holding its breath, and then footsteps echoed faintly from the far end, measured, deliberate, not rushed, not careless, but intentional, and that was enough to confirm what I already knew. I stepped slightly closer, just enough to shield her line of sight without making it obvious, my posture shifting without drawing attention, something instinctive, practiced, even if I had never admitted it out loud, and she noticed. I could tell by the way her expression changed, curiosity giving way to something sharper, something more aware. "You are not just a maid's son," she said, almost to herself, and the words landed heavier than they should have, because they were not supposed to be said, not supposed to be seen. And for a moment, I almost answered, almost told her something real, but the sound of another door opening down the corridor snapped everything back into place. The moment ended. The house came back to life. Voices returned, distant but present, and whatever shift had been building dissolved into something ordinary again, something safe enough for everyone else, but not for me. I took a step back immediately, restoring the distance that should have always been there, lowering my gaze just enough to fit back into the role I had spent years perfecting, invisible, replaceable, nothing more than part of the background. "It is nothing," I said, even though we both knew it was not, and for the first time since I had known her, Sophia Romano did not accept the answer. She studied me, really studied me, like she was trying to memorize something she was not supposed to understand, and then she nodded slowly, not because she believed me, but because she chose not to push, not yet. "You stopped me," she said softly, and there was something different in her tone now, something quieter, more certain. No one else would have. I did not respond, because there was nothing I could say that would not make things worse, nothing that would not break the fragile line I was already standing on. But as she turned to leave, her steps slower than before, I realized something I had not planned for, something I could not undo. She had seen me, not the uniform, not the role, me. And in a house where power noticed everything, being seen was the most dangerous thing of all. I should have walked away and forgotten the moment like it never happened, because that is how you survive in a place like this. You see something unusual, and you bury it. You keep your head down and your hands busy, and you pretend the world above your station does not exist. But the problem with being seen is that it changes the rules, and by the time I reached the end of the corridor, I could already feel it, subtle at first, like a shift in temperature, the kind of awareness that tells you someone else is paying attention now. The rest of the morning moved the way it always did, quiet orders, polished surfaces, footsteps that echoed just enough to remind you where you stood in the hierarchy. But underneath it all, there was a tension I could not ignore, a pattern that no longer matched the rhythm I had memorized over the years. I kept working, because that is what you do when you do not have the power to ask questions. But I listened more carefully, watched reflections in glass, tracked movements without looking directly. And that is when I noticed the change, security rotating positions earlier than usual, voices lower, more controlled, like something had already been reported before anyone said it out loud. By noon, I knew it was not my imagination. Someone had noticed something. Maybe not everything, but enough. I was in the service kitchen when it happened, the air cooler there, the scent of coffee and polished steel mixing with quiet conversation that stopped the second the door opened. And I did not have to turn around to know who had walked in, because power does not need an introduction. It announces itself in silence. Vincent Romano did not raise his voice, did not make unnecessary movements. He simply stood there, and the entire room adjusted around him like gravity had shifted direction. I kept my eyes down, steady, controlled, just another presence that did not matter, but I felt it when his attention landed, not on me directly, but close enough that my instincts sharpened without permission. "Something unusual happened this morning," he said, his tone calm, measured, but carrying weight in a way that made every word feel intentional, and no one answered, because no one needed to, not yet. He took a step forward, slow, deliberate, and I forced myself to continue what I was doing, even as every part of me focused on the space around him, on the way the room had gone completely still. "My daughter was interrupted," he continued, and there it was, not an accusation, not a question, just a statement waiting for the truth to reveal itself. I did not move. I did not speak, because speaking would mean stepping into a world I did not belong to, and silence had kept me safe for 18 years. But then I heard her voice. "It was nothing," Sophia said from behind him, and for the first time since I had known her, there was something deliberate in her tone, something chosen, not automatic, and that changed everything more than anything else could have. Vincent did not turn immediately, did not react the way most people would. He simply paused, just long enough to acknowledge the words without accepting them, and then his gaze shifted, not directly to me, but close enough that I felt it like pressure against my skin. "Nothing does not change patterns," he said quietly. And that was when I understood. This was not about what happened. It was about what it revealed, about the fact that something in his world had moved without his control. Sophia stepped forward then, closer to him. But her eyes flicked toward me for just a second, and in that second, I saw it clearly. She was protecting something, or someone, and that was the one thing no one ever did in this house without a reason. Vincent followed that glance, not obvious, not direct, but precise enough that it did not matter, and in that moment, invisible was no longer an option. He had not called my name. He had not asked a question, but somehow I knew. I had just stepped into his world, and there was no stepping back. He did not need to say my name for the room to shift around me, because everyone there understood exactly where his attention had landed. And in a place like this, attention was never accidental. It was chosen, measured, and once it found you, it did not leave without a reason. I kept my hands steady on the counter, the cloth still in my grip, the surface already cleaned but not yet dismissed, because movement was the only thing keeping me grounded, the only thing stopping the silence from swallowing me whole. Vincent Romano took one more step forward, slow enough that it did not look like pressure, but deliberate enough that it was, and I could feel the distance between us shrinking even though he had not directly addressed me yet. "Look at me," he said, not loud, not sharp, just certain, and that was worse, because certainty does not leave room for refusal. I lifted my gaze, controlled, careful, meeting his eyes for the first time, and it felt like stepping into something deeper than a conversation, like he was not just seeing me, but measuring everything I was not saying. His expression did not change, not even slightly, but there was something behind it, something calculating, like he was placing pieces together that no one else could see. "You were in the East Corridor this morning," he continued, not asking, just stating, and I nodded once, because denying something that simple would be pointless. "Yes, sir." My voice came out steady, even, exactly the way it needed to, and for a second, the room stayed still, waiting. "And you spoke to my daughter," he added, and this time, there was the smallest shift in the air, like a line had just been drawn that I was not supposed to cross. I could feel Sophia's presence behind him, not moving, not interrupting, just there, and that made it harder, because whatever I said next would not only affect me, it would affect her, and I understood that without needing it explained. "Only briefly," I said, choosing each word carefully, not too much, not too little, just enough to remain truthful without giving him more than he already had. His gaze did not leave mine, not even for a second, and that was when I realized something important. He was not looking for information. He already had it. He was looking for something else, something in the way I stood, the way I answered, the way I existed in a moment I was never meant to be part of. "Why?" he asked quietly, and that single word carried more weight than anything else he had said, because it was not about the situation, it was about me. The room seemed to close in slightly, the kind of silence that presses against your chest, waiting for you to fill it. And for a moment, I considered giving him the answer he expected, something simple, something safe, something that would put me back where I belonged. But then I remembered the look on Sophia's face, the way she had trusted me without knowing why, and something in me refused to reduce that moment to something small. "Because no one else moved," I said, and the words settled into the space between us, clear, unshaken, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted, not much, just enough to tell me that I had said something he did not expect. No one spoke. No one breathed. Even the air felt different now, heavier, like the house itself was paying attention, and Vincent held my gaze for a long second before turning slightly, not away, but enough to break the direct line between us. "Everyone leaves," he said, almost to himself, but loud enough for the room to hear, and I did not know if he meant people like me or something else entirely. Then he looked back at me, just once, sharp, precise, and in that single glance, I understood the truth I had been avoiding since this morning. I was no longer invisible, and in his world, that meant I was either a problem or something far more dangerous. The room did not move until he decided it could, and when Vincent Romano finally turned away, it was not dismissal, it was a choice, the kind that leaves something unfinished on purpose, like a door left slightly open so he can see who dares to walk through it. Conversations did not resume right away. No one rushed to fill the silence, because everyone understood that whatever had just happened was not over, It had only shifted somewhere else, somewhere quieter, more controlled, and far more dangerous. I lowered my gaze again, returning to the role that had protected me my entire life, but it no longer fit the same way, like something had cracked beneath the surface that I could not seal back together. My hands moved automatically, finishing what I had started, but my attention stayed sharp, tracking every detail, every reflection, every subtle change in the room, because now I was part of it whether I wanted to be or not. Sophia did not leave immediately. I felt her hesitation before I saw it, the way her presence lingered just long enough to matter. And when I finally glanced up, she was looking at me again, not with curiosity this time, but with something more deliberate, like she had made a decision she had not shared with anyone else. She stepped forward slightly, enough to close the distance her father had created, but not enough to draw attention, her voice quiet when she spoke. "You should not have said that." Her words were soft, but there was no accusation in them, only understanding, and that made it harder to ignore. "Neither should you," I replied before I could stop myself, the response coming out lower than I intended, more honest than it should have been, and for a brief second, something almost like a smile touched her expression before it disappeared just as quickly. "He noticed," she said, and I nodded once, because that was not something either of us could pretend away. "He notices everything," I answered, and that was the truth, the kind you do not say unless you have already accepted what it means. Her eyes studied me again, deeper this time, like she was trying to understand the part of me that did not match the life I was supposed to have. And I knew that look. I had seen it before in people who sensed something they could not explain, something just outside the lines of what made sense. "You were not afraid," she said quietly, and I almost laughed at that, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. "I was," I said, meeting her gaze just long enough to make sure she understood. "I just moved anyway." That seemed to stay with her, the words settling into the space between us in a way that neither of us tried to interrupt, and for a moment, the house felt distant, like everything else had faded just enough for this conversation to exist on its own. But moments like that do not last in places like this. A voice called her name from down the hall, sharp, controlled, and she straightened instantly, the shift immediate, the daughter of Vincent Romano returning without hesitation. She looked at me one last time, something unspoken passing between us, something neither of us had the language for yet, and then she turned and walked away, her steps steady, composed. Like nothing had changed, but everything had. I finished my work in silence, but the rhythm was gone, replaced by something heavier, something that did not belong to me, but had found me anyway. And as I stepped back into the corridor, I realized something I had not considered before. It was not just that I had been seen. It was that I had answered. And in his world, answers always come with consequences. That night, the house felt different, quieter in a way that did not bring comfort, but awareness, like every shadow had been sharpened and every sound carried further than it should have, and I could not shake the feeling that something had already shifted beyond what I could see. I finished later than usual, long after the main lights had dimmed and the upper floors had gone still, the kind of stillness that only exists in places guarded by people who do not sleep the same way others do. My mother had already left hours earlier, her shift ending before sunset, her world separate from mine even though we walked the same halls. And as I stepped out into the service corridor, I realized this was the first time I had been completely alone here since everything changed. Or at least, that is what it felt like. The marble floors reflected the low lighting and soft patterns, the kind that made movement harder to track unless you knew what to look for, and I did. Without thinking, my steps quieter, my breathing measured, my attention splitting between what was in front of me and what might be just out of sight. I told myself it was nothing, just the after effect of a long day, of being pulled into something I never should have touched, but instincts do not lie, and mine had been awake since morning. I reached the turn leading toward the back exit when I heard it again. That same subtle shift, not a noise, not exactly, but the absence of the right one, the kind of silence that feels intentional instead of natural, and I slowed, just slightly, enough to confirm what I already suspected. Someone else was there. I did not turn immediately, did not react the way someone inexperienced would, because reacting too soon gives away more than staying still ever does, and instead, I let the moment stretch, listening, measuring, deciding. Then a voice broke through the quiet, calm, controlled, exactly where I expected it to be. You learn quickly. I did not need to look to know who it was. Vincent Romano did not approach unnoticed unless he wanted to, and the fact that I had sensed him at all meant this was not accidental. I turned slowly, keeping my movements deliberate, respectful, meeting his gaze without hesitation this time, because pretending not to see him would be worse than acknowledging that I had. He stood a few feet away, hands at his sides, posture relaxed in a way that was not casual, but intentional, like everything about him had already been decided before he stepped into the corridor. Or maybe you already knew, he added, his eyes studying me in that same precise way that made it clear this was not a conversation, it was an evaluation. I did not answer right away, because I understood now that silence was part of the test, not avoidance, but control, and when I finally spoke, I chose the truth, not because it was safe, but because anything else would be obvious. I pay attention, I said, my voice steady, even, and for a second, something almost approving flickered behind his expression before it disappeared again. He took one step closer, closing the distance just enough to change the weight of the moment, and I felt it, the shift, the same one I had felt earlier, but sharper now, more focused. People in your position usually do not, he said quietly, and I knew what he meant, not just the job, not just the role, but the expectation that came with it, to exist without awareness, to move without impact, to never step beyond what was assigned. Maybe they should, I replied before I could stop myself, and the words hung in the air longer than they should have, bold in a way that crossed a line I could not uncross. Vincent did not react the way most people would, did not correct me, did not raise his voice, he simply looked at me, deeper this time, like he was searching for something specific, something he had not yet confirmed. Maybe, he repeated softly, and then, after a pause that felt deliberate, final, he added, or maybe they do not survive long enough to learn. The corridor fell silent again, heavier. Now, and I understood exactly what he was telling me without him needing to say anything more. This was not a warning. It was a choice. And for the first time since this began, I realized I was no longer just reacting to his world. I was being measured for a place inside it. Sleep did not come easily that night, not because of fear, but because of awareness, the kind that settles into your bones and refuses to let you return to who you were before. And I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every glance, every pause, because in his world, nothing was random, and that meant neither was I anymore. By morning, the house had returned to its usual rhythm, or at least it looked that way on the surface, staff moving in quiet coordination, doors opening and closing with practiced precision, voices low and controlled. But underneath it, something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, like a current running beneath still water. I felt it the moment I stepped inside, the way a few glances lingered half a second longer than they should have, the way conversations dipped slightly when I passed, not enough to draw attention, but enough for someone like me to notice. Word had not spread, not openly, but it did not need to, not in a place where information moved without being spoken. I kept my head down, my movements precise, returning to the patterns that had kept me invisible for years. But invisibility is not something you can reclaim once it has been taken from you, and every step I took felt just slightly heavier, like the floor itself was aware of me now. I was assigned to the West Wing that morning, a quieter part of the estate, far from the main rooms where decisions were made and power was displayed, and for a moment, I thought maybe that was intentional. Maybe someone had decided to move me out of sight, to return things to what they were before, but that thought did not last long. You have been reassigned, a voice said behind me, calm, neutral, and when I turned, one of the senior staff members stood there, his posture formal, his expression unreadable in the way that comes from years of knowing when not to show anything. To where? I asked, keeping my tone respectful, controlled, even though something in my chest had already tightened in anticipation of the answer. He held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, just enough to confirm what I already suspected before speaking. The upper level. The words settled heavily, because everyone knew what that meant: fewer staff, stricter control, closer proximity to the Romano family themselves, and most importantly, no accidents, no mistakes, no one unnoticed. Effective immediately. I nodded once, because there was no other response that would not make things worse, and he stepped aside without another word, the conversation already over before it had truly begun. The walk to the upper level felt longer than it should have, each step echoing just enough to remind me where I was going. And when I reached the final staircase, I paused for half a second, not out of hesitation, but out of understanding, because this was not a reassignment, it was a decision. I stepped forward anyway. The air changed the moment I crossed onto that floor, quieter, more controlled, the kind of silence that is not empty but intentional, and I adjusted without thinking, my movements slower, more precise, my awareness sharper, because this was not a place where you reacted, this was a place where you anticipated. I had only taken a few steps when I saw her again, Sophia, standing near the window at the far end of the hall, the morning light outlining her in a way that made everything else fade slightly into the background. And for a moment, it felt like the house itself had arranged this, like I had been moved here not for convenience, but for something else entirely. She turned before I could look away, like she had known I was there before I made a sound, and when our eyes met, there was no surprise in hers, only recognition, like this was exactly what she had expected. "He moved you," she said quietly, not asking, just stating, and I nodded once, because there was no reason to deny something that obvious. She studied me for a second, her gaze sharper than before, more certain, and then she took a small step closer, closing the distance just enough to matter. "That means something," she added, her voice lower now, more careful, and I knew she was right, because nothing in this house happened without purpose, especially not this. "Everything here means something," I replied, and the truth of that hung between us, heavier than either of us tried to ignore. She held my gaze for a moment longer, and then, almost like she was deciding something in real time, she said, "Then you should be careful." I almost smiled at that, not because it was wrong, but because it was already too late for careful to matter, and as I looked at her, standing there in a world that had always been hers, I realized something that changed everything again. I had not just been brought closer to power. I had been placed exactly where he wanted me to be. Careful was not a strategy here, it was a delay, and delays only worked for people who still had the option to step back. But I crossed that line the moment I answered him, the moment I chose to move instead of stay invisible, and now every step forward felt less like a choice and more like a direction already set. The upper level had its own rhythm, quieter, more controlled, but sharper in a way that made every detail matter, from the way doors closed without sound to the way footsteps never echoed unless they were meant to, and I adjusted quickly, because I had to, because this was no longer about blending in, it was about not making the wrong kind of impact. Sophia remained where she was for a moment after speaking, her eyes still on me, like she was measuring something she had not decided how to name yet, and I held that gaze just long enough to acknowledge it before stepping past her, because staying too long would turn something unspoken into something visible, and visibility had already cost me more than it should have. "Ethan," she said quietly behind me, and I stopped, not because she called my name, but because of how she said it, not as a command, not as a question, but like it belonged in her voice in a way that it never had before. I turned slightly, enough to see her without fully facing her, keeping the distance that this place demanded, even if it no longer felt real. "You did not tell him everything," she continued, and there was no accusation in it, only certainty, and that was the part that mattered. I studied her for a second, weighing the question behind her words, because she was not asking about the moment in the corridor, she was asking about something deeper, something I had not spoken out loud to anyone. "Neither did you," I replied, and the corner of her expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close enough to show she understood exactly what I meant. Silence settled between us again, but it was different now, not empty, not uncertain, but shared, like we were both standing on the same line without admitting it. "He is watching you," she said after a moment, quieter now, more careful, and I nodded slightly, because that was the one thing I did not need confirmed. "He always is," I answered, and that truth felt heavier here, on this floor, where his presence was not just implied, but constant, woven into the structure of everything around us. She took another small step closer, just enough to narrow the space between us in a way that felt intentional, and lowered her voice even further. "That means he has not decided yet," she said, And I knew exactly what she meant, because people like him did not observe without purpose. They evaluated, they measured, and then they chose. And if he does, I said, letting the rest of the thought hang without finishing it, because we both understood the outcome without needing to name it. Her eyes held mine for a second longer, steady, unafraid, and that was the part that unsettled me the most, not the situation, not the risk, but the fact that she was not stepping away from it. Then maybe you should decide first, she said softly, and that changed something again, because it implied a choice I had not considered, not just survival, not just reaction, but direction. I let out a slow breath, not breaking eye contact, because if there was one thing I had learned, it was that hesitation here was louder than action. Maybe I already did, I said, and the words felt more real than anything I had said so far. For a moment, neither of us moved, the space between us charged with something neither of us tried to explain, and then footsteps echoed faintly from the far end of the hall, controlled, deliberate, the kind that did not belong to staff, and we both knew who it was before. We turned. Vincent Romano did not appear immediately, but his presence arrived before he did, shifting the air, tightening the space, and I felt it again, that same pressure, that same awareness. Only this time, it was not distant. It was intentional. And when he finally stepped into view, his eyes went not to his daughter, but directly to me, like he had been listening the entire time, like this moment had always been part of whatever plan he had already set in motion. And in that second, I understood something I had been avoiding since the beginning. This was never about what I did. It was about what I was willing to become. The moment he stepped into the hallway, everything aligned, not in a way that felt natural, but in a way that felt designed, like every second before this had been leading here without me realizing it. And I straightened instinctively, not out of fear, but because something in me understood that this was no longer observation, this was judgment. Vincent Romano did not rush, did not need to. His presence filled the space before his steps did, controlled, precise, the kind of movement that made everyone else adjust without being told. And when he stopped a few feet away, the silence that followed was not empty. It was deliberate. Sophia did not speak, did not move, but I could feel the tension in the space between them, something unspoken, something that had been building long before I stepped into their world. And for the first time, I realized I was standing in the middle of something that had nothing to do with me, and yet somehow, everything to do with me at the same time. His gaze stayed on me, unwavering, measuring in a way that made it clear this was not about the moment anymore. It was about what came next. You adapt quickly, he said, his voice low, controlled, and I recognized it immediately. Not praise, not approval, but acknowledgement, the kind that comes before a decision is made. I held his gaze, steady, because looking away now would undo everything that had already been set in motion, and I had come too far to pretend I did not understand what was happening. I pay attention. I repeated the same words as before, but they felt different now, heavier, because now they meant something. More than survival. For a second, nothing changed, and then he took one step closer, just enough to shift the balance again, to make it clear that this was not a conversation between equals, no matter how it appeared. Attention without direction is wasted, he said quietly, and I understood what he was offering, not directly, not openly, but clearly enough for someone paying attention. A path, a test, a choice. I did not respond immediately, because this was the moment Sophia had warned me about, the point where hesitation would define everything, and I could feel her eyes on me, not interrupting, not interfering, but present, like she needed to see what I would do without influencing it. I let out a slow breath, grounding myself in the only truth I could rely on, the one thing that had guided every decision I had made since this started. Then give it direction, I said, and the words settled into the space between us, clear, unshaken, and for the first time since this began, something in Vincent's expression shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore, not surprise, not approval, but recognition, like he had just confirmed something he had been testing for all along. The silence that followed was different now, not tense, not uncertain, but resolved, like a decision had already been made without being spoken out loud. He held my gaze for one long second, and then, without breaking it, he spoke again, softer this time, but far more final. Be in my office at 8, he said, And that was it. No explanation, no elaboration, just an instruction that carried more weight than anything else he could have said. He turned before I could respond, his attention already shifting away like the outcome had been decided the moment I answered, and Sophia exhaled quietly beside me, the sound almost lost in the stillness of the hallway. I did not move, not right away, because I understood what had just happened, not fully, not completely, but enough to know that this was no longer about staying invisible or even surviving. This was something else entirely, something deliberate, something chosen. And as I stood there, feeling the weight of that single instruction settle into something real, I realized the truth I had been avoiding since the beginning. I was not being pulled into his world anymore. I had just been invited in. 8 o'clock did not feel like a time. It felt like a line, and as the minutes moved toward it, everything else became background, routine without meaning, motion without focus, because no matter what I did, my mind stayed fixed on what waited behind that door. I finished my shift without mistake, without hesitation, every action precise, controlled, the way it had always been. But beneath it, something had changed, not in how I moved, but in why I moved, because for the first time, I was not just following orders, I was walking toward one. The hallway leading to his office was quieter than the rest of the house, not empty, but contained, the kind of silence that exists when people know better than to linger. And as I approached, I felt it again, that same awareness, that same pressure that had followed me since the moment he noticed me. Only now it was sharper, more focused, like everything had been narrowing down to this point. I stopped just outside the door, not out of hesitation, but to measure the moment, because once I stepped inside, there would be no returning to what I was before, and I understood that clearly now. Then I knocked. Once, controlled, deliberate, and his voice came immediately, calm, certain, like he had been expecting me at that exact second. Come in. The room was larger than I expected, but not excessive, everything placed with intention, dark wood, clean lines, no unnecessary details. And at the center of it all, Vincent Romano stood by the window, the city lights stretching out behind him like something he owned without needing to claim it. He did not turn right away, and I did not speak, because I understood now that silence was part of this, not empty, but structured, a space where he decided when things began. You arrived on time, he said after a moment, still facing away, and I nodded once before answering. Yes, sir. My voice remained steady, even, but I could feel the weight of his attention even before he turned, like it had already settled on me long before I entered the room. When he finally faced me, his expression was the same as before, controlled, unreadable, but there was something different behind it now, something more defined, like whatever uncertainty had existed earlier was gone. Tell me, he said, stepping forward slowly. What do you think this is? The question was simple, but I knew better than to treat it that way, because nothing he asked was ever just what it sounded like, and I took a second, not too long, not too short, to consider the only answer that would not place me back where I started. A decision, I said, meeting his gaze directly, and something in the room shifted, subtle, but real, like the answer had aligned with something he was expecting. He studied me for a moment, longer than before, like he was measuring not just my words, but everything behind them, and then he nodded once, slow, deliberate. Correct, he said, and that single word carried more weight than anything else he could have added. He moved past me then, not close enough to intimidate, but close enough to remind me exactly where I stood, and stopped just beside me, his voice lower now, more precise. You were not tested for what you did, he continued, and I felt the meaning of that before he finished the sentence. You were tested for what you would choose to do next. I did not move, did not respond immediately, because I understood now that this was not about proving anything. It was about defining something, and when I finally spoke, I did not look away. Then I chose, I said, and for the first time, the words felt complete, not reaction, not instinct, but intention. The silence that followed was not uncertain, not tense, but settled, like the outcome had already been decided before I walked into the room. And Vincent let out a quiet breath, not approval, not relief, but acknowledgement, the kind that marks the end of one thing and the beginning of another. Good, he said simply, and then he stepped back, creating just enough distance to change the meaning of the space between us. Because from this point forward, he added, his voice steady, controlled, you do not belong to the background anymore. The words landed with quiet finality, and I felt it, not as pressure, not as fear, but as something else entirely, something heavier, something real. He had not raised his voice. He had not made a threat, but somehow, that made it more absolute. And as I stood there, in a room I was never meant to enter, listening to a future I had never planned begin to take shape, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else he had said. I had not just stepped into his world. I had been given a place in it. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and permanent, like they had been placed exactly where they were meant to land. And for a moment, I did not move, not because I did not understand, but because I understood too well. Not part of the background anymore. That meant visibility. That meant expectation. That meant there was no version of me that could go back to what existed before this room. Vincent did not watch me the way he had before, not measuring, not testing, but confirming, like whatever he needed to see had already been decided. And now this was simply the next step in something that had been set in motion long before I realized I was part of it. You will remain on the upper level, he continued, his tone even, controlled, like he was discussing something routine, even though nothing about this was routine, but your role will change. I kept my posture steady, my attention focused, because this was the moment where details mattered, where every word carried weight beyond what it sounded like. You will observe, he said, and I felt that immediately, not as an instruction, but as recognition, because that was what I had already been doing, what I had always done, just without permission. And you will report only to me. The room went quieter somehow, like the statement itself had shifted the air, and I understood what that meant without needing it explained. This was not a promotion. It was a position, a placement, something that existed outside the structure everyone else followed. Yes, sir, I said, my voice steady, because anything else would have been noticed, and I had already learned that being noticed now came with a different kind of consequence. He nodded once, not approving, not acknowledging, just confirming that the answer matched what he expected, and then he stepped back toward the window again, the conversation already moving past me even though I was still standing in it. You will not be given instructions twice, he added, almost casually, but I knew better than to mistake it for anything less than absolute. And I inclined my head slightly, because understanding did not need to be repeated. For a moment, nothing else was said, and I thought that was the end of it, that I would leave this room with nothing more than what had already been decided. But then he spoke again, quieter this time, but sharper. My daughter, he said, and the shift in tone was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, is not part of your role. The words were clear, precise, and I felt the weight of them settle into something more complicated than a simple instruction. I did not respond right away, because this was not just a boundary, it was a warning disguised as one, and when I finally spoke, I chose my words carefully. Understood, I said, and for the first time, I felt something behind his silence, not doubt, not concern, but awareness, like he already knew that nothing in this situation was going to remain that simple. He turned then, fully this time, facing me again, and for a second, the room felt smaller, more focused, like everything outside of it had been removed. Do you, he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate, understand what happens if you misunderstand me? The question was not rhetorical, not symbolic, it was exact, and I met his gaze without hesitation, because hesitation would have been the only wrong answer. Yes, I said, and the truth of it did not need to be explained, because understanding here was not about knowledge, it was about acceptance. He held my gaze for one final second, long enough to confirm that I meant it, and then he stepped aside, not dismissing me, but releasing me, like the moment had reached its natural end. Good, he said simply, and with that, the conversation was over. I turned and walked toward the door, my steps measured, controlled, but everything inside me had shifted into something new, something sharper, something that no longer fit the life I had been living before. And as I reached for the handle, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else he had said. This was not about what I could do. It was about what I was now responsible for. And responsibility, in his world, was never given without a reason. The hallway outside his office felt colder than before, not in temperature, but in meaning, like every Step I took carried something new that had not been there when I walked in, and I did not rush, did not look back, because I understood now that hesitation was no longer uncertainty. It was a signal, and I could not afford to send the wrong one. The door closed quietly behind me, sealing that moment into something final, and for a second, I stood still, letting the silence settle, letting everything he said rearrange itself into something I could actually use. Because this was no longer about surviving the moment, it was about understanding what came after it. Observe. Report only to him. Do not misunderstand. And most importantly, do not involve Sophia. The last part stayed with me longer than the rest. Not because it was unclear, but because it was too clear, like he was not just setting a boundary. He was anticipating something before it happened, and that meant he had already seen something neither of us had said out loud. I moved down the corridor slowly, my steps quieter now, not by habit, but by design, because observation starts with presence, and presence here had to be controlled, intentional, unseen, and less necessary. The upper level was still as I left it, the same quiet precision, the same measured silence, but now I understood it differently, not as a place above the rest, but as a space where everything mattered more. Every glance, every pause, every decision. I passed the window where Sophia had stood earlier, and for a moment, I expected her to be there again, like the house had arranged that encounter the same way it had arranged everything else today, but the space was empty, and somehow, that felt more significant than if she had been waiting. She was not avoiding me. She was respecting the line that had just been drawn, even if neither of us wanted it there. I kept moving, because standing still too long would turn attention toward me again, and attention was no longer something I could treat lightly. As I reached the far end of the hall, I noticed something I had not seen before, not because it was new, but because I had not been looking for it. Small changes in positioning, subtle adjustments in routine, security moving in patterns that did not repeat, like someone had already started testing the edges of something larger, something that had not revealed itself yet. And that was when I understood the real weight of what he had given me. This was not about watching the obvious. It was about noticing what did not belong before anyone else realized it existed. I slowed slightly, letting my gaze move naturally, not fixed, not searching too hard, just enough to take in what most people would miss. And piece by piece, the pattern started to form, incomplete, but present, like a signal waiting to be understood. Something was changing inside this house. Not loudly, not visibly, but deliberately. And for the first time since this began, I realized something that shifted everything again. I was not here just because of what I had done. I was here because of what I could see. A door closed softly somewhere behind me. Not rushed, not careless, just precise. And I did not turn, because I did not need to. I had already learned that reacting too quickly revealed more than staying still. Instead, I kept walking, my pace unchanged, my attention sharpened. Because this was the moment where everything Vincent had said stopped being instruction and started being real. Observe. Report. Do not misunderstand. And as the quiet of the upper level settled around me again, I felt it clearly, not as pressure, not as fear, but as something far more dangerous. Purpose. Because now, every step I took was no longer just mine. It belonged to something bigger than me. And in this house, that meant every step mattered. Purpose changes the way you see everything, not all at once, but slowly, like light adjusting to darkness until details you once ignored become impossible to miss. And as I moved through the upper level, I could feel that shift settling deeper with every step, turning instinct into something sharper, something deliberate. The house had not changed, not on the surface. The same quiet discipline, the same controlled movement, the same unspoken rules that kept everything running without interruption, but beneath it, something was different, and now I knew why. It was not the house that had changed. It was my place in it. I stopped near the end of the corridor where the glass overlooked the city, the skyline stretching out in clean lines of light and distance, and for a moment, I let myself stand still, not because I needed rest, but because I needed clarity. Because this was the first moment since everything began where no one was watching, or at least, no one obvious enough to matter. You see it now, do not you? Her voice came softly from behind me, and I did not turn immediately, not out of caution, but because I already knew it was her, the way I had started to recognize her presence without needing to confirm it, something that should not have been possible, but was. Yes, I said after a moment, my eyes still on the city, because looking at her right away would have made it something else, something more than what it was supposed to be. It is not about what happens, I continued quietly, the realization forming into words as I spoke them. It is about what is about to happen. I heard her step closer, just enough to stand beside me, not touching, not crossing the line her father had drawn, but close enough that the distance no longer felt like separation, and for a second, neither of us spoke, the silence between us not empty, but understood. He trusts you, she said finally, her tone softer than before, not questioning, not doubting, just stating something she had already decided was true. I almost corrected her, almost told her that trust was not the word for what he had given me. But I stopped, because maybe she was not wrong. Maybe in his world, this was what trust looked like, controlled, conditional, but real enough to matter. He expects me. I replied instead, because expectation carried more weight, more consequence, and she nodded slightly, like she understood the difference without needing it explained. That is more dangerous, she said, and there was something in her voice now, something quieter, something that had not been there before, and I realized she was not just talking about him anymore. I turned then, finally meeting her eyes, and for a second, everything else faded again, not because it disappeared, but because it did not matter in the same way, not in this moment. "So is standing here," I said, and the words were simple, but they carried everything we had not said out loud, the line we were both aware of, the one we were both choosing not to step away from. She held my gaze, steady, unafraid, and for a moment, it felt like the world had narrowed down to something small enough to hold, something almost simple, but moments like that do not last in places like this. A faint sound echoed from down the hall, controlled, precise, and we both knew what it meant without turning, without confirming, because awareness had become something we shared now, whether we were supposed to or not. She stepped back first, just enough to restore the distance, to respect the boundary that had been set, and I did the same, because some lines are not crossed openly, not here, not like this. "Be careful," she said again, but this time it was different, not a warning, not advice, but something closer to a promise, and then she turned and walked away, her steps steady, composed, like she had always belonged to this world in a way I was only beginning to understand. I watched her go for a second longer than I should have, and then I turned back to the city, to the lights, to the distance, to the reminder that there was still a world beyond this place, even if I no longer belonged to it the same way. And as the silence settled around me again, clearer now, sharper, more defined, I understood the final truth of everything that had happened since that first moment in the corridor. I had not just protected her. I had stepped into something that would not let me leave. Because in a world built on power and control, being chosen is not freedom. It is a beginning.